Hello and welcome to the J plus R movie podcast. This time it will be kind of a special episode because rather than covering a film that's come out like a while ago or maybe a year ago or something like that, we're going to instead cover any of the films that we saw last year, divided up between like the ones that we liked, the ones that maybe we didn't, the ones that we agree on, the ones that we disagree on, and also kind of just generally how our experience was going back to the cinema last year, which is what we will start with. So, given the obvious situation that happened in 2020, how cinemas were largely shut, how was it for you returning to the cinemas in 2021, being able to see films fairly regularly again? What was that experience like for you?
Because I started working a lot more full time in that period, I didn't get to cinema as much as I'd like. However, it was great to be back in the cinemas. Really happy they're open again. I'm happy that they've stayed open as well, so they didn't really shut down over Christmas. So we're still able to go and see all these films that we weren't able to see a year ago. And I think it's just a really, really nice space. Although I have to admit, getting used to the audiences again takes a little bit. Just because, my God, I forget how much people love to talk at the cinema. But it is a really, really good experience. I'm really, really happy that we're back because for quite a few films, it is the place to go and see them. The experience is worse if you're not watching them there.
I started going back in May because May is when the theatres did start opening over here in the UK, 5 months without going to the cinema at all. And then finally I got the chance to go back. And it was really, really gratifying. At that point, the quality of the films didn't even really matter. It was just more like, wow. There was a point where I was fairly hopeless and thinking that it would be a long time before we got this. But, we did, and it was great. Work at a cinema as well. So that does give me a bit more of just a general connection. And although it's been very, very hard when it's been busy, I'm always happy that it is busy, because when the cinema is busy, not only is that good for the view business, but it's also just a sign that people just enjoy going to the movies, enjoy seeing them, and enjoy experiencing them and stuff like that, especially if it's something that's really good. Let's kind of more hone in on the films themselves. Let's start out with musicals, because that was interesting. In 2021 we had like 4 major musicals. We had In the Heights, Dear Evan Hansen, West Side Story, and Tick Tick Boom. Those were like the major ones, and I've only seen 2 of them, and coincidentally, the 2 that I have seen are the ones that Lin-Manuel Miranda made. In the Heights was good. It was a bit overhyped, but it was a good movie. Have you seen it?
I've not seen In the Heights.
I'd recommend it. It's not like an amazing film or anything. It was still good for what it was. Tick Tick Boom, I thought was really, really impressive. I would count that as a surprise.
There are very few musicals I tend to like. A lot of the ones that are kind of celebrated as, these are great musicals, I don't connect with. But I think I found it quite special. I think it was because it really set up the major conflict really, really well for me. And because music was so entwined in the guy's life anyway, and with what the character's career was, and I mean, I know he's a real person, but I'm going to say character. And because of what his career was, the kind of way creative process was shown to us, I fully bought that he would just randomly sing about his life and use it to make music. And because it was framed in the narrative of the play as well, it was almost like a weird fusion between performance and memory at points. I found that really interesting. That kept me engaged and stopped me from disconnecting with the music. So I was able to not just appreciate the music, but as a storytelling device, which for me quite often doesn't happen.
Would you consider that to be both biggest surprise and maybe perhaps your film of the year?
Honestly, yeah. I did not think that was going to be my film of the year. Like, on paper, that would never have been my film of the year, but it was just a really, really great lead performance from Andrew Garfield. I think he was fantastic.
I agree.
As John Larson, you had this. There are parts of the film that made me uncomfortable purely based on my own experiences. Like when he's sitting there going, I've spent 8 years toiling over this script. I'm just there like, cool, I'm on year 4 of one of mine. I feel that. And it's really nice to see how that single-minded obsession wears its relationships, and it's really other people, and he doesn't notice because he's almost so consumed. I really like that because it's not like showing him being intentionally a prick, but he is, because of how much he's willing to put aside for this one thing. And I thought it was really, really fascinating to watch that and his relationships, especially as people around him were dealing with comparably harsher things. I mean, you had the whole AIDS epidemic going on during the film. You had his girlfriend was having to so many people were having to give up their careers for stability because of things going on in their life. He should have been doing that. He didn't have that option. While the single-minded determinism was admirable, you can also see how that cost him personally. And I think it's really, really interesting because the film does have him sacrifice so much. It really does ask the question if it was worth it. And I think it comes on the side of yes, but that doesn't mean it doesn't suck. I found that really, really moving and sad but joyful at the same time. And I think that balance was near perfectly done.
So I agree with everything that you just said. I did love it because it was such a good portrayal of the sort of single-minded artist, who's dreaming big and trying to make sacrifices, but is constantly hitting roadblocks. I think that Lin-Manuel Miranda, for like a debut film, I think he handled it very well. Like, despite the seemingly small scale, it felt very cinematic, and he kind of imbued the film with a sense of like heavy emotional power. And he did a lot of creative things, like cutting between like the stage and the real events that were going on, or even how some of the musical numbers were like done too. Absolutely hits like big heights. Particularly, I think the big standout scene for me was the bit where he's playing the piano outside, and he's having that song, and it's almost like he's kind of having that full realization of how important that friendship was. And that really hit me hard.
Like, he's almost having a musical breakdown. It's probably one of the most emotionally raw things I've seen. You get the pain in a way that a lot of films just can't communicate because they don't have that layer. I mean, it's one of the first times I've sat there and looked at a musical as an art form and gone, I see why this is necessary now. Because quite often, like, I sit there with film musicals and I go, this didn't need to be a musical. Like, I could have gotten more power in a big cut. I don't need that floating camera. I don't need that grand splendor. I don't need that. I think a lot of it is because the script sets the character up, like, it sets it up so well. When those moments hit, like, I always go back to the argument with the girlfriend as well, because you almost see the rose-colored memory of it versus what it actually was. It's quite amazing because the film relies on memory. It makes memory a performance, and it's a commentary on how we will use memory as a performative structure to get across points to ourselves. And the only thing that the main character's doing is externalizing that. I think that little undercurrent of reminding everyone that relationships, memories, just existing are performances. Like, best friend that went in advertising, spoilers here, he had AIDS. I was watching back through the film and I struggled to notice that, even though I know. You could see that was performance from that character, but like, as in the story, he was performing as if he was okay. How much the characters were holding back themselves and almost performing versions of themselves that everyone else would like better, and that gets stripped away as the tension piles on and the dream all consuming. And I thought that was a really, really good way of piling that pressure on, so that when we get to the end of the film, you see John grow as a person who realizes that he needs to be fair to people around him. His single-minded obsession, while he needs to keep going, he needs to push forward. He can't forget about everyone else as well. And the fact that he doesn't then lends power to the final moment. It just makes it this emotionally. I'm getting a little emotional just talking about it.
You spoke excellently about that film. It is a really good movie. Also, Andrew Garfield had a really good last year as well.
He had a great last year. And the thing is, like, he's had bad years like previously. He's a great actor and has always done well. But I think this is the thing. I think this has really propelled him into the spotlight again.
Even in something that I wasn't a huge fan of, like, I don't know, like Under the Silver Lake, for example. Like, I said, he was still really, he still like clearly gave it his all in that film, and
he was great at that. I mean, I didn't like the film either, but he was really good. And do you know what I think is interesting? I think that Tick, Tick, Boom might actually have been better for him than Spider-Man this year. Both were very, very important to him. That's not a knock on him and Spider-Man at all, because I mean, I'll talk about this more when we get there. But he was definitely one of my favourite parts of the Spider-Man film. Definitely. It really has been a year for Andrew Garfield. I hope it continues because I really, really want to see him do some more. I don't know what he's going to do next. I've got no idea. And that's really, really exciting to me.
I've not kept an eye on his filmography. If we're going to go on to what my movie of the year would be, this is the first year where I don't know if I can necessarily pinpoint. I mean, I can try, but I don't know if I can pinpoint one. I can pinpoint 3, and that might sound strange, but I can pinpoint 3 films that I'm thinking to myself, or like all of these ones where I'd be like, yeah, that was really good. That was, I'd absolutely recommend it. It was really well done, and I guess we could probably go through them one at a time, especially if you've seen any of them. But to move on to the next one, the one that I can potentially more talk about, Pig.
I actually really like that film.
This was another surprise as well. I knew it was going to be good, but I didn't expect it to be such a deconstruction of like the revenge film, a complicated dramatic story that again was fairly unpredictable for me and like very efficiently used its 90-minute runtime to tell its story in and out, but also give a lot of heavy dramatic like pathos with some fairly complicated characters. Another actor who I think had a good last year, Nicolas Cage. It's definitely up there with one of his best dramatic performances. He's very subtle and restrained. It's a performance that's just like brimming with emotion. Probably one of my favorite endings of last year as well. So that's how I'd sum it up. How would you sum it up?
I think it's one of Nicolas Cage's best roles in the last few years. I think the restraint really benefits it because his star image is so tied up with the crazy. The restraint makes him so much more unpredictable. I think one of the things that I loved about this film is that I saw the opening of it and I'm like, okay, I'm getting really heavy John Wick vibes. I'm not sure I'm into that because I've seen. I mean, I really loved Nobody that came out this year, but I was kind of there like, we've had a bit of a John Wicky film. I'm not sure I want to see that. And then as it got into the city, I was getting more that way because like, oh no, there's this random guy that he knows, and he's like, oh, you've not been a name here for 10 years. Oh God. And then it turns out he was a chef, and I was like, okay, I am so much more into this. He wasn't violent. Like the film wasn't violent. There was that one moment of violence, and then it wasn't. It was people who'd given up on things because of tragedies or traumas or just difficulties, and it was so fascinating to watch. The man who probably lost the most, or near enough the most, was Nicolas Cage. I mean, his wife had died; he couldn't cope with it, so he lost his connection to humanity, and he left. He ended up in a cabin in the woods, finding truffles with a pig. Like literally, his only connection was a pig, and he got through. But he saw through everyone's like veneer. I think my favorite scene in the film was actually at the high fancy restaurant with his protege, where he just sat there and he basically just went, "What happened to the pub, man?" And he coaxed out the guy had given up his dream for success, and it was really moving. It was shot quite objectively. It didn't use music or anything like that to get you to it. It just let the performances speak for themselves and the rhythm of the dialogue get it. And I think, I mean, it's quite sparse on dialogue, to be fair, the film. It's not, massively talky, but I think when it gets those moments, it's great. And the fact that the climax of the film to get the pig back was reminding the antagonist, if you like, of their empathy and their wife by cooking their dinner. I thought that was one of the most sensitive and bittersweet climaxes I think I've ever seen.
It's basically the most sensitive and empathetic example of an enhanced interrogation, so to speak.
In most films, that would be like an extra torture scene, and he's like, "Nah, I got the most painful memory of all here," and it was all just playing the emotion. And then I don't think I've ever been that upset about animals' death watching a film because it was just like, "Oh God, not the pig." It was the only thing he had, and it was interesting to let them build a connection. Him and Amir, watching that relationship build up, and Amir starts siding with him, and then it gives him that one bit of connection, and it finally lets him finish listening to that song from his wife for his birthday. And it was
that's the thing I would say about the best films of last year, is that all of them got to me emotionally, and that ending really did get to me. That was like really powerful. There were other scenes early on that I think carried quite a lot of weight to them. And were very like bittersweet, as you said. But yeah, I loved it. I think it's among. It would make a great like double feature with like Mandy, the other Nick Cage film that's kind of about him losing something. It's a sign of like Cage's like extreme comeback. I feel it's probably even more of a sign because he showed that he could do this, but he also did Prisoners of the Ghostland as well, which is a very like weird, like purposely campy, strange neo-western, so to speak. It's a film that I wasn't a big fan of Prisoners of the Ghostland, but that's more just for the style itself, not necessarily as much for the execution. And Cage in that film was playing at the top, but I think it worked quite well. I think he's shown that he can now veer effectively between deliberately out there and big, but also very subtle and nuanced.
He's always been an interesting performer, but I think he's in that point where everyone's remembering that again. And I'm really, really excited to see what he does next. The Night House. I don't know what I think of this film. It's pretty much about this woman whose husband has killed himself, and it's about her in the days, weeks, in the immediate aftermath of that, trying to cope with it and work out maybe why that had happened and quite what had happened, as she's getting increasingly paranoid and distrustful and almost unhinged with the amount that she's looking into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really, really, on paper, it's definitely very, very interesting. But I thought it was shot relatively well. It had some pretty decent performances. It didn't quite connect with me. One of the reasons I wasn't so engaged with it was the ultimately it was a bit too supernatural. And I think that's something that really gets to me about horror film. For some reason, I really don't like supernatural horror, because for me it's quite often just lazy, and the films quite often build up quite an interesting element of psychological horror and then undercut it with supernatural. I think that's what annoys me about it. Because I think something that's straight up supernatural, I don't mind so much, but something that's got that potential to be a really decent psychological horror, and it's all based in the actual mind, and then it switches out to be some supernatural thing, even if it then mixes it back in like this film did, that just doesn't click with me.
For me, I think there was enough of an indication fairly early on that that's kind of where it was going for me. So I was just immediately able to adapt to it. What I felt was that it was a fairly good blend of drama and horror. The film definitely could have been a purely psychological horror, but I do think that they still told a fairly interesting story about a person discovering why this dead husband lost his mind and then killed himself. A similar thing happening to his wife. I thought that the film was fairly good at communicating that. The ones that look like they were going to be really great, like Last Night in Soho, for example, and it just sort of ended up being good. It had a lot of good things about it, although well shot, and although it had an intriguing story and it had even had some social commentary in there, it didn't really come together that well. So what you were talking about as well, being kind of forceful, I kind of felt that way, that a lot of it was just loud noises, loud, flashy, intense, loud music, loud things happening, big things that just becomes kind of obnoxious as opposed to scary. Not that I've observed that loads, but that is something where, like, when a horror movie does that, I've just sort of turned off to it, because I'm just like, oh god, this is just starting to get legitimately hard to sit through.
It was fine, because I found it very disappointing. It was competently made.
Yeah, I would actually say it was its best aspect was probably just the look and the cinematography at times, and stuff like that.
The production design was awesome. I wasn't scared. I was maybe mildly uncomfortable, if that. The old woman twist was obvious. You always knew that the creepy guy wasn't going to actually be Jack, just because that was the most obvious move you could make, and it's Edgar Wright, so you know he's not going to make that move. The mystery that isn't that mysterious, honestly, isn't that great. And I think it would have worked better as a drama. I really do. It wasn't trying to scare us, and it was just playing it straight. I actually would have been more invested than I was, because when I started to get even the slightest bit interesting, it decided to try and get scary, and I was just like, I'm out. I'm done. I'm not into it. I think it was anchored by good performances. I think the 60s vibe was captured really well. I liked the way it transition to the modern. I think the overall tone was well balanced. It had some of the Edgar Wright cutting that I liked, but I've got no desire to go back and watch this film.
I'm a little bit more positive. I would say I was a bit more engaged in it, but I wouldn't say I was ever like massively blown away by anything that it really did. It does absolutely have its heart in the right place in terms of the social commentary that it's trying to get out. Probably the best thing about it is that I did think that it was fairly effective in communicating the whole toxic nostalgia.
The time period wasn't as great as
yeah.
I thought that was great, and that I found that probably the most horrific element of the film, and that I did like, but
but that could, I think it just needed a stronger story to be weaved into. I mean, in some ways, I mean, Edgar Wright kind of did a similar thing in The World's End as well. Like, he tackled a similar theme of nostalgia not being what it's cracked up to be, and he did do it better there. It might get cult following in a few years' time, but I do think it could have been like his greatest film, and it just didn't end up being his best. Let's move on to the action genre, because that was interesting, because it wasn't the case for us in the UK, but in the US, a couple of the films that were there to help like welcome people back to cinemas were like action films. Two ones specifically. You brought this one up earlier, so let's go into both of these. Nobody and Wrath of Man. Nobody, first of all, I think you and I might be in a bit of a disagreement on this, but you tell me what you thought.
I think I liked it a lot more than you did.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of my love with it is the stunt work. Because I make no secret of the fact that I love action films and I've got a deep respect for really high quality stunt work. And this film just has little moments of it that is, even when it gets a bit dumb towards the end, that are just genius. Like there's the, on the bus fight, which was probably one of the best fights I've seen this year, where they're getting into it with a knife and he tries to stab the guy and it's like, oh, the block's done. There we go. And then the guy who's been blocked just starts cutting at his wrist. Like, that's just like absolutely what you would do, and genius move of brutality. It seems like a John Wick clone, and it's not. You know, you have part of the entire incident being a fucking cat bracelet. It's like, really? I'll admit, I sat there and went, really? But then as you get into it, you realise it's about a guy who's just got this itch he can't scratch for violence, and it almost became a story for me about your nature not really being able to change. And then going back to it and thinking back about it, I think it actually works a lot better once you know the films like that, because I think it benefits from a rewatch. Nobody, because at first it's like, oh, this is decent, I guess, kill some time, and then watching it back, it is actually almost quite sad, because you see that he's just nothing when he's repressing his life, and you then see him, he gets the things that he needs because he is who he is. And I think that's kind of a story I think is relevant today, because there is a lot of pressure, I think, to almost sacrifice elements of yourself to fit around other people. I think there's a lot of social responsibility these days, and I think it can almost be too much. Not to say that you don't have a responsibility to others, but you have a responsibility to others, not the socially acceptable you that you put out. And I think that's part of what the film is, and I responded to that. It helps that it was also just really, really brutal, well put together. Great surprise performance from Bob Odenkirk. Really well done action film, very, very good hand to hand. And it's, again, still kind of rare to see that in Hollywood. I mean, John Wick and things like that have made it a lot more likely that you'll see really decent action, decent stunt work, but I still feel the need to praise it whenever I see it, because it's great to see something so grounded work so well physically.
I did enjoy myself. There was nothing like major that I really disliked about it, but I did think to myself, there was a part of me that would have preferred it if it was just an outright parody, or maybe if it was completely subversive. Like, obviously John Wick is the comparison, it's from the same writer as well, so that makes sense. But even in general in the action genre, there are quite a lot of films that have that similar kind of setup and storyline. The guy who used to have like a violent past, and then he's returning to it, and he does like action stuff, and he's like doing it to protect people as well. Well presented as it was, as good of a job as Bob did in playing an action lead, in playing a tough guy, that it was cool seeing him play it pretty much completely straight. There's a part of me that wishes that it had been more of a satire or more of a parody, something that would take that genre and give it a lot of freshness. The stuff that you read into it is good, and I might give it a rewatch and just watch it under that lens. But for me personally, I just thought to myself, this is a subgenre of action film that needs a unique inspiration. At this point, I do think it's starting to wear thin.
The reason I didn't feel like that about this film is because you almost had the idea of, it seemed less reluctant, and it was more like the peaceful life reluctant this time rather than the violent one. It was about an addict relapsing hard. They'd really played that angle up. I think you would have had something that was a little bit more subversive while still getting to the core of what's under the undercurrent of a lot of action films, but they don't directly say, because it's not easy to empathise with.
To empathise with a guy who just wants to cause violence because they enjoy it.
Yeah, that's ultimately who the character is. He wants to fight. Violence makes him feel like a man, makes him feel complete. And the film does show that. But I think if they played that up, I think people would have responded better to it, because that is relatively unique.
The film definitely has a comedic edge, a bit of a dark edge. Was even okay with the idea of just making it a full-on parody.
But while I disagree that this film should have been that, I absolutely agree that there should be a film like that.
Yeah, and to move on to the other major one, Wrath of Man. This was a surprise for me as well, which I feel like I'm saying a lot, but this was a surprise for me, because this is Guy Ritchie and Jason Statham teaming up once again. For something I thought was just going to be a fairly generic, like, kind of action heist film, I feel like it's Guy Ritchie's darkest, definitely his most bleak, and one where I feel like he most doesn't really play to convention and is willing to tell a film not about a redeemable, justifiable anti-hero, but kind of just a bad guy who has a sympathetic motive. I think that it did show a bit of an evolution, I think, in Ritchie's career, that he was willing to just straight up play it to the bone, like not try and make it comedic, not try and make it fun, just tell a really dark, grisly heist film. Well, not even really a heist film, almost a film where a revenge movie is infiltrating a heist narrative. And I kind of appreciated that about it. I mean, what was your opinion on Wrath of Man?
I did not like it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to like it, but I felt like the action was a little bit crap. It was lacking any sort of Guy Ritchie style. I didn't emotionally connect. Bad guys doing things for a sympathetic motive, I've seen done better than that. The structure of the film kind of hurt it. Jumped here, there, and everywhere with time, and I didn't care. I always sat in my head, went, "Good, you bastard." When his son died, I shouldn't have felt that way. I didn't care that his son had died.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly, I mean, his son was innocent. Don't get me wrong, but like, it almost felt like karma because the amount of people that he has definitely had killed, I just had no sympathy for him because it was a bit like, "They're wrong. Your son dying is tragedy. That should have been you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
B, you kind of put him there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is on you."
I mean, for me, the non-linear stuff worked fine. There was just something to me that, even though I didn't really connect with him, because I did think to myself, well, you're not really a good guy, you're kind of just a bad person. This isn't like a huge spoiler because it's revealed in the first act, but it's revealed that, like, Statham, who seems like this, like, just newcomer, he's not just more competent than he appears, he's also a straight up crime boss that's basically posing as this employee, so therefore he can, end up getting revenge on this, like, heist crew that killed his son and stuff. Something just very effectively grim about this film. It didn't necessarily make me really connect with the people, and I see why that's a problem, because typically in a narrative like that, I don't think it's that hard for a film to really make you care about somebody who's lost a son or a family member. But in this one, they didn't use that for humanity. They used it more to show just how ruthless and intelligent he was.
It was actually quite cliche until the last act. The last act, again, it wasn't even that something we haven't seen before. I mean, all the robbers killing each other. I like that. It was done better in The Dark Knight. I still liked that moment, and I thought, it had one or two things that were quite inventive. Like at the end, the fact that they were wearing body armor made it like 10 times harder, and that was quite interesting. I almost liked that the hero didn't get his revenge there and had to go find him later. Quite like how simple the end was. Shoots him in the places of the autopsy report, and I thought that was great. And Jason Statham, again, Jason Statham's always great and fun.
Appreciate that he was willing to not really play a character there wasn't a forced attempt at trying to make him a good guy. I think this was one where it almost weirdly felt like Statham was kind of taking his usual role, but just zapping out the humanity and compassion that would typically at least be done in something like The Transporter.
It felt like they were trying to humanize him, and that the fact that he wasn't humanized was a happy accident rather than an intentional thing. And I think if it had a little bit more style to it, because I feel like any director could have made that. I think that's what I don't like about it, because I love Guy Ritchie normally. And I think I've defended some of his slightly worse films.
What ones do you think are not as bad as people say?
Rock and Roller. I love Rock and Roller. I love his Sherlock Holmes films. Sherlock Holmes films, they're usually criticised quite a fair bit, but I quite enjoy them. It didn't feel like it had the real passion behind it. It felt almost like a generic action film that had slightly interesting concepts rather than a generic action film done by a filmmaker with a new angle on it, which is different.
Okay. It does do the time jumping, but aside from that, I understand what you mean, where it's not as energetic as this other movie. It's not really trying to be fun.
I don't even necessarily need to be fun.
You can sense, even in a really serious, gritty film, if the filmmaker is really, really passionate about the film that they're making.
Yeah, you can. And I just didn't get it for this. I think that was the thing that, I think that is the film that I hated the most this year, but I think it's because it's one of the ones I had the highest expectations for. I remember seeing the trailer and being so excited, and I watched it. I was like, which is a bit unfair because I suppose it's part of my own expectations playing into that. But
so you put this as the most disappointing.
Hands down for me, this is the most disappointing I've seen this year.
I agree. He might not have been as passionate about this one. I still felt that it was him trying to play against hype a little bit and be a bit different. Yeah, but that could just be because I'm a bit familiar with the fact that Ritchie, after he did that Aladdin remake, he set himself to do it 3 films afterwards. So it's kind of clear that he must have just taken the money and just used it to fund these like slightly smaller, slightly more in his wheelhouse films. So there is a part of me that thinks that just naturally that he did really want to like make something really good here.